Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Andrew Sorota. I work at the office of Eric Schmidt, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's conversation on 5 dimensions of scaling democratic deliberation with and beyond AI, where our two co-hosts, Claudia and Sammy, will be sharing their important new paper. To give you a sense of the next 90 minutes or so, we'll begin with around a 20-minute presentation from Claudia and Sammy on their paper. We'll then invite reflections and interventions from the three discussants that have joined us today, Kyle, Oliver, and Manon. Thanks so much for joining us. And then we'll move to a Q&A portion of the event for the remainder of the time. I might start with some questions for myself and then certainly want to include all of our attendees. So I want to encourage everyone to make use of the chat function. I think in many ways, the design of this digital event was one of thinking about scale, the question of how do you include large numbers of people in a conversation. And so we hope everyone feels welcome to engage and participate. In the past, these events have been quite lively in the chat. And so I hope this one is the same. I'll do my best to try to keep track of the great questions and comments. But if I miss anything, feel free to post it again. There's no harm in doing that. So I want to begin here maybe by just thanking all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. I think everyone can agree that this is a particularly tense moment in global politics for a number of reasons. I think one of the key ones would be the extremely precarious position of democracies around the world. And in fact, I think that that's the very reason why many of you might be interested in this conversation, or at least why I am. And so I'm grateful that we can all come together to think together about the path forward and what alternative democratic futures might look like. So today we are talking about scale. And we hear this all the time, scale in a lot of different capacities, scaling businesses, AI scaling. Maybe the first thing you don't think of is scaling democratic deliberation, although perhaps you should. And so one thing I was curious about just in the lead up to this conversation was when this term scale really started being popularized. And so I'm just going to share my screen quickly here. This is um, a very low tech example of research, I guess. But I just used Google's Ngram viewer feature to look up when the term scale really started being used more in books and discourse. And I think this is really fascinating because what we'll notice here is that it really started to pick up in around the mid to late 18th century, which also was the time when modern representative democracy really emerged. And the reason why I think this is interesting, and I mean, I would definitely venture to say that this is more correlation rather than causation, but I think that the term scale became interesting in that context precisely because we were transitioning from a model of democracy from ancient city-states where direct participation of citizens was deemed feasible to larger republics where it was thought that representation, and in this case, electoral representation, was really needed to enable democratic decision making, quote unquote, like at scale. Today, many people are saying that AI is changing everything, is making it such that this is no longer the case. It invites new ways to imagine democratic decision making at scale. But what exactly do we mean by at scale? And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today. And it's also why I think this new paper by Claudia and Sammy is such an important contribution to the field of democratic innovation. And so with that, I'm delighted to introduce Claudia and Sammy, our two presenters today. Claudia Chwalisz is the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext. She previously led the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation from 2018 to 2022, and she played a central role in designing the world's first permanent citizens' assemblies. Thanks, Claudia. Sammy McKinney is an AI and Deliberation Fellow at DemocracyNext, and also a PhD student in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge. And with that, I will pass it over to the two of you.
Great. Am I on mute? No, I'm not on mute, I think. Good. Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. It's really a huge delight to be able to share this paper that we've been working on for the past few months together with Sammy and with input from quite a large number of people. And very much looking forward also to the questions and the conversation that we'll have afterwards. I'm going to kick us off and then I'll pass over to Sammy and I will wrap up again at the end of our presentation. So to begin with, just to give you a little bit of context about what is Democracy Next, for those of you who might be new to us and our organization, we are an international research and action institute, which is focused on scaling high quality, empowered and permanent citizens' assemblies. And our mission is to shift who has power and how are we taking decisions together, both in government, but also in other organizations of daily life. So how can we be applying these ideas in schools and workplaces, museums and financial institutions? And so why are we interested in scaling deliberation? I think it's important to stress that we're looking at this question through a rather political lens. So as Andrew was saying at the beginning in his introduction, we're living in a time where there are threats to democracy as we know it, where there's authoritarianism on the rise, there's closing civic space. And so there's a need to be thinking about how can we be strengthening collective agency and how do we have a citizenry that is resilient to the forces of autocracy, one that is powerful and connected, where people are and feel heard, and where we can be strengthening trust between people, but also in institutions, and where public institutions have greater legitimacy and better alignment with collective values. So we believe that democratic deliberation contributes to helping achieve all of these goals. And so how can we make this something that is more widespread? Before diving into some of the meat of our arguments, we wanted to also define what we mean by democratic deliberation in this paper and the way that we're talking about it, because we decided quite intentionally to take a somewhat narrower scope rather than talking about deliberative democracy or deliberation more broadly, really thinking about what the OECD calls representative deliberative processes, in the academic literature often get called deliberative mini-publics. Democracy Next, we've often used the term citizens' assembly as a bit of a shorthand for this wider terminology. But what we're talking about here is a smaller group of people who is selected by sortition, meaning randomly selected to be broadly representative of a community, to spend significant time learning and collaborating through facilitated deliberation to find common ground and form collective recommendations for policymakers, decision makers, or the community. And our decision to focus on this was really linked up to also the lens through which we're looking at this in that political sense, and feeling that deliberative mini-publics, representative deliberative processes are really one of the best and highest quality ways in helping to achieve those goals. In this paper, we ask the interconnected questions of what does scaling democratic deliberation mean, why is it valuable, and in what ways should we use AI to enable it? And we hope to be making two contributions to the wider field. One is to offer an expanded definition of scale by breaking down this concept across 5 dimensions, and also to propose that scaling democratic deliberation is not a technological challenge alone, much as some people in the field might argue, or much as we might hope might be possible. We really want to emphasize that we feel that it needs to be combined with strengthened civic infrastructure if we are going to be achieving this goal of scaling that we're interested in. So I'm going to pass over to Sammy now to talk through the 5 dimensions of scale.
Thanks so much, Claudia, and I'm very happy to be here, very happy to talk through the 5 dimensions of scale that we break down in this paper. So this typology of scale is inspired by 2 core observations. Firstly, there's increasing interest in the concept of scale, and Andrew's graph actually showed this trend. And that occurs both across society as a whole and within deliberative democratic practice, and more specifically, especially relating to AI's role in scaling deliberative processes. And secondly, and despite this, we still lack a shared vocabulary and framework for understanding scale and its various dimensions. So within current practice and research, the concept of scale is used in a variety of ways. And in the paper, we suggest that this could undermine critical discussion, informed action, and ultimately the co-creation of visions for future practice. So we propose a five-part typology of scale to address this. These dimensions are scaling out, scaling up, scaling across, scaling deep, and scaling in. For each of these dimensions, we do three main things. We break down what the scale dimension refers to. We identify the core goals and incentives around pursuing that dimension of scale. And we offer a few examples of how AI may be able to enable it. So the first dimension we consider is scaling out, which refers to increasing the number of citizens participating in a deliberative process. And this can occur in two ways. So we can scale out directly by increasing the number of citizens participating within the many public's deliberations. So for example, we've seen this in relation to deliberative polling and with recent processes having thousands of people participating in contrast to other forms of many public, where it's often just tens or hundreds of people participating. And processes can also scale out indirectly by providing opportunities for the wider public to input their perspectives and experiences and stories relevant to the deliberation topic. There are many different goals to scaling out, so including increasing the representativeness and normative legitimacy of the process and bringing the benefits that Claudia mentioned earlier to many more people. There are a number of ways that AI may be able to enable this dimension of scale. So we talk a little bit about AI facilitation, which has been attracting relatively significant attention across the field. So that refers to using algorithmic systems to uphold deliberative norms in place of a human facilitator. As group sizes scale out, this becomes particularly important because there aren't that many human facilitators to perform that role. As group sizes scale out, the question of sense making also becomes quite challenging. So how can we use AI to identify the core themes and narratives and points of agreement and disagreement that arise within larger scale processes? People are interested in how we can use AI to help us grapple with that. The second dimension of scale is scaling up. So this refers to applying deliberative processes to higher levels of governance. And in particular, here we have in mind global and transnational deliberation. So it's widely accepted that many of the most challenging and complex and pressing issues that we face go beyond national boundaries. And so people are interested in how we can scale up to address the democratic and epistemic deficits that exist within supranational governance. In the paper, we focus on AI translation as one example amongst many others of how AI may be able to help enable deliberation across linguistic divides. The third dimension we consider is scaling across, which refers to increasing the number of deliberative processes that are occurring across a political system. And this really has two main dimensions as well. So firstly, you can scale across by having more deliberative processes across different governance issues. So for example, hosting deliberative processes on climate, environmental governance, AI governance, education policy, health policy, and many other the whole amalgamation of issues that affect our daily lives. And then the second dimension of scaling across relates to how can we apply the principles of deliberative processes beyond the context of government to workplaces, to schools, to the education system, and expanding beyond government. And so there are many different goals surrounding scaling across. So we can think about out of the many issues that affect our lives, it's good to increase citizen engagement across them and thereby spread the benefits of participation to many more people and to many more decisions. In the paper, we discuss one main example of how AI may be able to support scaling across, which is called the Assembly Assistant. So in 2023, Democracy Next published an assembly guide, which breaks down the core steps of how to plan and deliver a deliberative process. And we're now exploring ways that we can make this guide more interactive and context sensitive to the integration of AI, how it can maybe help with some of the challenging initial steps of setting up an assembly, such as helping draft invitation letters to participants. And this is aiming to serve the higher order goal of making it easier and more effective for people to set up deliberative processes. The fourth dimension we consider is scaling deep, which refers to increasing the impact of deliberative processes on the political system. And there are also two dimensions to this. The first is through increasing impact via institutionalization, which refers to anchoring or embedding deliberative processes within governance systems and normalizing them as an important feature within decision making. And the second dimension of scaling deep refers to creating stronger connections of deliberative processes to the wider public sphere. So deliberative processes are commonly critiqued on both of these counts for lack of impact on the decision-making bodies, as well as for lack of impact on the wider public sphere. And so the goal of scaling deep is to promote meaningful impacts and to enable the redistribution of political power across society. We discussed a few different ways that AI applications may be able to play a supporting role within this complicated task of scaling deep, such as helping communicate outputs with the wider public in more engaging ways, such as anchoring the outputs in the voice of the assembly, as well as support with aspects of report writing, such as aiming to increase the implementability of recommendations that the mini public arrives at. And the last dimension of scale that we introduce in the paper is scaling in, which refers to increasing the quality of deliberation that occurs within the process. So it's widely accepted amongst deliberative theorists and practitioners that deliberation is a matter of degree. That is to say that we can speak of higher or lower quality deliberation. And so the goal of scaling in to promote higher quality is to increase the legitimacy, the inclusiveness, the transparency, and the trust in the deliberative process. There are again many different ways that we may think about using AI to support scaling in, such as to create more inclusive learning materials that cater to a diverse audience, for sense making and idea visualization to track the ideas that are introduced across the deliberative process, as well as to identify absent perspectives or discourses that aren't being integrated and voiced within the mini public. So our hope is that this typology and framework for scale provides a foundation for a more critical and precise engagement with the concept of scale across the field, especially as it relates to AI's role within scaling deliberative practices. But we tried to go a bit beyond this in the paper by providing two different ideas around future research. So the first is we propose that it's important to expand our repertoire of critically informed deliberative technologies across these 5 dimensions of scaling identified. This provocation occurs against a backdrop where much of the energy is going towards how we can use AI to directly scale out deliberative processes to many more people, such as through artificial facilitation and mass online deliberation platforms. In the paper, we consider, or we suggest that using AI to enable scaling in this way may actually hollow out the richness of deliberative processes. We suggest that smaller group dynamics can enable the relationality, the sense of togetherness, and the deep co-creation of processes that are so essential for quality deliberation, for trust building, and ultimately for mending the fabric of democracy. However, our core claim in this part of the paper is not to oppose the use of AI to scale out deliberation. For the reasons we mentioned earlier, there are a number of important considerations to this end, and also technological advancements may address some of the concerns that we have. So rather, our core claim is that a holistic view of scale should guide technological innovation. And that requires us to ask what role can AI play in increasing the quality, impact, and number of deliberative processes, as well as the number of citizens they reach. Something that's so essential as we do this, though, is that we also need to expand our critical understanding of the new concerns and challenges that AI integration brings. So from limited transparency, problematic biases, the excessive dependency or reliance on technological infrastructure. There are many different kinds of challenges that AI integration brings. And so as we expand our technological repertoire, we also need to expand our critical vocabulary for engaging with the concerns that are raised and potentially develop principles that can help us navigate such challenges. So, next step for research that we are planning to pick up on the back of this paper is to rigorously map out and critically analyze AI applications across the full life cycle of deliberative processes, whilst keeping this holistic understanding of scale in mind. And with that, I'll pass back to Claudia.
Great, thanks, Sammy. So I'll pick up on the second avenue for future research that we've identified, at least one of the many, because I think there's going to be more than just these two main avenues, but these are ones that we are ourselves anyways going to be focusing on in some ways. And that second one is related to the limits of AI, but also that emphasis and importance of civic infrastructure that's needed to enable scaling, because we make the claim that scaling democratic deliberation is not susceptible to a technological fix alone, as much as we are indeed interested in the ways that technology could be helping to enhance and help achieve this goal as well. We think that deliberative processes should also be connected to and influence sites of power, that we need to encourage participation and engagement from the politically marginalized, that there's a need for a plurality of political issues that affect our lives to be considered through different kinds of deliberations. And so we need to do three things. One is to deepen and strengthen the connections between deliberative bodies and public officials if we're to achieve that scaling objective. Also to grow the peer-to-peer learning and community networks across and within policy issues as well, and to develop and promote the mechanisms that equip people to be able to participate within a deliberative process as well. And all of that requires the careful integration of technology alongside investment in civic infrastructure to support this kind of social and political change that we're interested in. So one of the next steps for our research is to do a bit of a deep dive into Aranzazu Lab as a case study. Aranzazu Lab sort of, let's say, embodying or being an example of what we mean by civic infrastructure when we're talking about it in this way. And what Aranzazu Lab is a democratic innovation lab in the Basque Country that was set up in 2020 and has played really a critical role in helping to catalyze the scaling of deliberative democracy and deliberative mini-publics across the region. 5 years ago, there were no examples that have taken place, and now there's been many examples at different scales of government within the region. We're also collaborating on a project with Mondragon Corporation, which is one of the world's biggest and largest cooperatives that's based in the Basque Country. There's growing numbers of practitioners who have the skills to do this, and Aranzazu Lab has really played this kind of critical glue of connecting the political side of things with policymakers, with practitioners, amplifying the kind of networks, but also connecting with academics, ensuring there's evaluation and learning for the iterative nature of doing things that do get anchored and embedded. And so we want to understand, well, what's context specific to the Basque Country, because of course there will always be some things that are such, but we also think that there are surely aspects of how this model works that could be replicated in other places. And so how can technological innovation and this type of civic infrastructure effectively be combined to make high quality democratic deliberation something that becomes more widespread and impactful? So to conclude, the path towards scaled deliberation involves bridging technological innovation with democracy's fundamental human elements, the trust, connection, understanding, and collective agency. And by embracing this hybrid approach, we can work towards a democratic future where technology enhances rather than replaces the rich interpersonal dynamics at the heart of effective deliberation to build democratic resilience in an increasingly complex world. So thanks very much for your attention, and I will pass it back to Andrew now.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Sammy. Super rich and concise and useful for framing this conversation. I already see that the chat is booming with really interesting and incisive questions and comments, and I'm itching to get to them. I realize that first we should hear from our three discussants, and please feel free to take your time. Don't feel rushed. I know you all prepared statements, and we're all curious to hear them. I'll introduce the three of you all together, and then we can go into your reflections. So I'll start with Oliver. Oliver Escobar is Professor of Public Policy and Democratic Innovation at the University of Edinburgh. where he focuses on participatory and deliberative democracy, political inequality, and future governance. Kyle Redman is a researcher and practitioner in deliberative democracy. He is the democracy lead at the AI and Democracy Foundation and program manager at the Federation for Innovation in Democracy Europe. Previously, he was the director of research and design at the New Democracy Foundation in Australia. And last but not least, we have Manon Revel, who is a postdoctoral AI research scientist at Meta Fair, which is Meta's AI research lab. Her research bridges applied mathematics, AI, and political philosophy to model and enhance collective intelligence. She holds a PhD in social and engineering systems in social and engineering systems and statistics from MIT. So I'll start with you, Oliver. Maybe one question we can get to frame your reflections would be, we have a typology of 5 different kinds of scaling from Sammy and Claudia, inside a deliberation versus around it. Where do you see AI delivering the biggest benefits, and how do they interact with each other?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and hi, everyone. Okay, I'll get to that question, but first let me just thank the organizers and Hannah and Ruba behind the scenes, and to thank Sammy and Claudia for their work and for bringing us together around this timely issue. So I think anyone who has been involved in organizing citizens' assemblies, juries, panels, and so on, it's fairly easy to imagine how helpful AI can be for some of the key tasks and some of the support, both to the organizers and participants. You can, imagine to get the right type of assistance, to summarize lots of content, for example, content from large-scale public engagement prior or during the process, to translate across languages, to make evidence more accessible, to potentially sift through transcripts so that all the arguments that lead to a conclusion can be transparently synthesized and open to scrutiny, or to be able to check in real time, for example, whether a policy proposal or recommendation already exists, or how what is being proposed relates to existing policy. So there are all these uses, right? You could also improve deliberative quality to ask for counter-arguments when there is an easy or shallow consensus that is emerging and may undermine the deliberative quality of a conversation, or potentially as well to get a facilitation co-pilot that can help to monitor power inequalities in a group. So there are all these exciting potential improvements for the internal dimensions of these processes. It might help to improve deliberative quality, accessibility, inclusion, maybe the depth of argumentation, maybe the level of considered judgment, maybe the quality of the counter-arguments, and again, the accessibility of evidence. And I think there is also potential to improve the external dimensions, especially related to policy, to political impact. But you could also think of ways of developments that might help with social and economic aspirations as well. This paper says less about these external dimensions, but my understanding is that there are going to be other papers. This is the paper that kicks off the series. So this is something that we're going to have to keep grappling with, how to make deliberative mini-publics contribute to a broader deliberative democracy. So there is a lot of excitement, understandably, a lot of excitement about the prospect of scaling deliberation, but there is also a lot of work to be done on what it means in practice, what are the desirable and undesirable consequences of using AI in this context. So this is a very welcome paper because it offers a thought-provoking take on different dimensions of scaling and helps to discuss both the potential and the risks. So it's a great starting point. One of the areas where perhaps I take a different view to Claudia and Sammy is related to their concern about using AI for mass deliberation. I understand why they favor smaller groups like mini publics. But I wonder, this is a challenge I want to put to them for later on when they reply to us and to other colleagues in the audience. I wonder if this gives up on the aim of building deliberative democracies at a scale. It is not possible to build deliberative democracies just by building more and better deliberative mini publics. So deliberative democracy in the classic critical strand is a paradigm for social change, and therefore it must involve the entirety of society, which is a key tenet of participatory democracy as well. So I think that is something I would like to hear a bit more on. And at the moment, a lot of effort is going into improving mini publics, and this is good and understandable. But we keep perfecting mini publics while they remain part of very imperfect institutional and governance systems. So broader democratic reform and innovation are crucial. And this is a point that Sammy and Claudia also made very well. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of the potential that is mapped out could be applied to other spaces of democratic deliberation, parliaments, other institutions, schools, the media sphere. So there are many arenas for experimentation at the scale. And this should be good news for the civic tech industry, as it makes the work less niche, because you're developing things that potentially could travel across all kinds of spaces. Now, to finish my 7 minutes, I just want to finish with a reflection about the intersection between the fields of democratic innovation and civic technology, and the challenge of working better together when it comes to the development of AI. This is about the challenges of building civic infrastructure, which I was really glad to see in the paper. And my sense, but other colleagues here in the webinar will tell me if I'm wrong. I think there is a strong dissonance between the democratic innovation community of practice and the civic tech community of practice. Too often they work separately in parallel tracks, and we can't afford that on this issue and at this particular juncture. So civic tech colleagues sometimes go down a track that doesn't consider democratic thinking, and democratic innovators sometimes make too many assumptions about the technological side. So this has to be a shared project with many difficult conversations along the way, including some of the basic challenges related to the carbon footprint, the biases, the blind spots, all the usual stuff. But Sammy and Claudia express very clear caveats and call for prudence and critical thinking as we embark in AI experimentation in the field. As we know, and people like Shannon Ballor have carefully argued, AI is a troubled mirror. It is always incumbent upon us to ask what types of AI can be genuine collaborators, but also what must be protected from AI, what is worth leaving outside the emerging AI world. And there are plenty of reasons to be suspicious. AI is not emerging as a commons, as infrastructure built for the common good, but to augment the capacity of corporations and the state. So we've seen this before with the development of the internet, for example, and we now find ourselves scrambling to work out how this technological infrastructure can remain humane. So the points that Claudia and Sammy make about civic infrastructure are crucial, especially in the political economy of what Nancy Fraser calls cannibal capitalism. So we need to keep asking critical questions. Who is building AI for democratic innovation? Who owns it? Who does it serve? How does it embody democratic principles and practices? How does it help to redistribute power? That's why I think it is critical that this is built as a public commons, public infrastructure held in common ownership, which is not easy. But power, potential, and peril hang in the balance of this key question. And therefore, I think this is where the struggle will unfold in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Going next to Kyle, perhaps one way we can get into your comments would be, what do you view as the biggest shortcomings of deliberative processes as they currently exist that could potentially be filled by AI or not?
Cool, thanks, Andrew, and hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I have a lot of thoughts in that space. I think there's heaps of work to do, so I will get to those points. I really enjoyed reading and contributing to the paper. I think it makes a really good contribution to these sort of discussions around what deliberative process we should be running, their different forms, and how AI will play a role, like whether we want it to or not. And I sort of see the dimensions of scale relating closely to these different axes of sort of capabilities, maturity that I think deliberative processes need to improve along. And so often I'm thinking generally, what do we need to do to improve these processes so that they can be increasingly used for the important national and international governance challenges that we're facing, and how can we ensure that that definitely goes well? And so that leads to a whole bunch of questions like how do we do X and how can we solve Y technical blocker that I think practitioners and technologists are always thinking about, and what way now that AI and this emerging technology can play in answering them. And so I think for each of these dimensions of scale, there are critical R&D questions. Sammy and Claudia touch on them in the paper. I think there's a long list along each dimension. They include things like what has been mentioned before and is everyone's sort of natural default way of thinking about scale, which is what are the best ways to include as many people as possible in deliberative processes, but also things like how do we manage coherent subsidiarity across many different deliberations that are happening either in one process or across an entire political system. How can we better trigger or automate the sort of setup and operation of deliberations within a system? If these are going to be happening frequently across many different spaces, we would like them to be almost automatic in some way. And then also just, yeah, how can we make the deliberative processes themselves better generally? And so I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. I'm excited to see that lots of people are beginning to be quite ambitious about what or how this might be possible. And so I see these dimensions as pretty helpful frames for thinking about what directions we need to head in with our work. But I also appreciate the sort of the judo move that's sort of happening here, which is sort of taking the default association of scale, which is just like size and getting bigger, and use that on itself to sort of spotlight the other important transformations that need to take place. And I think maybe these other transformations are more important. Many people, as Oliver has mentioned, people associate large numbers with legitimacy, I think because of how traditional democratic principles like autonomy and self-governance and equal worth were translated into our existing institutions. But there are many contributions to legitimacy of within decision-making processes other than size, including whether or not they're fair, well-informed, deliberative, but also effective and efficient. And I think the performance of those functions, the trade-off against one another often when we're thinking about designing these systems. And so we can't just do all of them at once. So for example, adding more and more people into a single process can have some inclusion risks around who is even taking up those seats, but it might also negatively impact the deliberative quality in the room, which is what Sammy and Claudia have just mentioned. But I think it also really significantly might impact the incentives for individuals to participate, and including the extent to which they put in effort when they are participating, and the sense of sort of personal and maybe even, yeah, like moral responsibility they have as representatives. I think as you get more and more people into processes, that dilutes. And I think my intuition is that that has a negative impact on their contributions. But it also will affect, I think, the kinds of outputs that are possible with processes. And so that is kind of all just to say that when we are designing these systems or processes or even entire institutions, we have these deliberative democratic functions that we want to sort of optimally perform. And we're doing our best to provide some actors with the sort of optimal conditions and incentives to perform them, given all of the relevant constraints and context and that kind of thing. And what I think technology and AI in this instance can do is to help reduce or eliminate the fact that these trade-offs exist by making our processes more capable in various different ways. And I don't think that the trade-offs will completely dissolve, but I think it enables us to be a bit more ambitious with what's feasible or possible with these approaches. And so I have two other general thoughts. One is that I think we can also think beyond individual instances of deliberation and think more about how these processes can contribute to a system that cohesively addresses issues of inclusion, representation, and legitimacy and scale across a number of processes rather than bit by bit. I think this is sort of what happens with our existing institutions and representative democracy, and I think we could think creatively about how deliberative systems might do this. But this raises some interesting research questions. There's lots of them, but I think one in particular is sort of how we can guarantee sort of membership or representation guarantees across almost like an expanding set of panels rather than looking at sortition and representation in single instances. And there's also then that coherence thing, which is how if we have many panels happening all over the place, how do we ensure that they have consistency across them? But my second thought is that within the sort of intuitions that I've just shared and Claudia and Sammy have and Oliver has, and I'm sure Manon has, they're sort of like internal assessments that I'm making based on a combination of my experience running a lot of these processes and understanding how they work quite deeply. But none of that is really empirical. And some people go through the exact same process of thinking about these things and they arrive at different conclusions to me. And not to mention the sort of obvious point that these things vary dramatically through context and where you are in the world. And for example, one question I think about a lot is how much learning do people need to do to reach some kind of desired or optimal amount of understanding of themselves, of each other, of the policy problem, to make informed decisions about trade-offs. And what happens if we move the slider around there, which is giving them more time to learn and how long it takes and that kind of thing. And there is some kind of optimal setting there for our process designs, or maybe there are multiple settings that deliver different types of outcomes. But we don't really know the answers. And I think what that raises is that we need metrics and measurements to accurately determine whether or not these intuitions that we have about what's possible and which is the right direction, whether or not those intuitions hold. So that really just raises like what measurable criteria would tell us whether or not people are learning or using that information, and how would we non-intrusively measure, which I think is another problem lots of research needs to go into. So I think there's some set of ideal outcomes that we can mostly agree on. And then I think the actual disagreements are maybe closer to contesting our predictions of what types of process design decisions are more likely to result in those outcomes. Which is sort of to plug that I've started to do some work in this space, but I think there's lots of work to do. And so if anyone is interested in that, please reach out. And finally, I just wanted to mention something that is motivating my work in this space. I think Oliver sort of touched on it just at the end there, and it might also address some people in the crowd who are thinking like, why AI? What about all the problems? And which is that it's all good and exciting to have this new technology. It looks poised to turbocharge all these efforts that we're working on, but it also looks poised to kind of dramatically change society as a whole. And I think the default version of that looks like it could go quite badly. I think it's important that those developments are governed democratically, both inside the labs, but also inside our governments. And so it's important that we improve these new democratic innovation processes that we're operating as fast as possible so that they're ready when or if they are called upon for these moments. And that I think means that they must be AI enabled in order to keep pace with the change that's about to happen. And so then obviously there's a bunch of research that needs to happen around the fairness and safety of those things and these tools. But yeah, so lots of work to do.
Thanks so much, Kyla. You hit on some really crucial points, many of which have also been mentioned in the chat. Things like changing incentives, um, and having the right metrics to measure the efficacy of these integrations and so on. So appreciate that. I would also like to point out that there's a really interesting poll list that has been sent around in the chat to try to gauge the group's view of some of the topics that are being discussed. So I'm really pleased to see that. And there's even a WhatsApp group that Iggy is sending around. So thank you, Iggy. I think it's true that we won't be able to answer all of the questions that have been put in the chat. So if we can have a way to continue the conversation offline, that would be wonderful. With that, passing it to our final discussant before we turn to Q&As from the audience. So to Manon now. I think one way to frame your thoughts might be we've spoken about some of the trade-offs. I'm interested in the path to integration, how quickly that happens, what it should look like. And I know you've thought a lot about what over-reliance on AI and democratic deliberations might look like. If you could speak on that, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
Yes, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks so much for the amazing paper and organization. It's indeed fantastic to see the Polis group that I was looking, and so nice to see it coming live, and visualization is also great. So I'd like to start from where Claudia and Sammy conclude their paper. When you say that the intersection of technology and democracy represents one of the most consequential challenges of the 21st century, something I couldn't agree more with. And I do think that you do a really nice job at working at this intersection of this narrow path between, indeed, as Andrew, you were saying, this idea of under-reliance and over-reliance. Under-reliance, briefly, I think there is very rational skepticism around AI in terms of how it can remove collective agency. Also, some of the core limitation of these systems not being fully intelligent or reasoning or biased or having hallucinations. And I think all of these things are true. And we should not use them to overshadow the fact that we do have a new tool in our toolbox. I think very simply, we have a tool that now is capable of processing, analyzing, and organizing free-form texts, which I think is one of the reasons why there is so much excitement about using AI for deliberation, because free-form, open-ended thoughts is really what a discussion is made of. And it's the first time that we have a tool that can, at scale, process this kind of information. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that we have this new tool in the toolbox, and we try to not move away from them too much, because they could indeed, that could make us be less fast at improving democratic processes. On the other end, and this is something that I think have been greatly covered in the paper, I think does a really good job in discussing, there's also a big risk of over-reliance. And as mentioned in the paper specifically, I think the idea that we can now scale up deliberation and increasing the number of headcounts comes indeed as an easy way to think through how we can scale deliberation. And I also agree that we need to be super careful in not abstracting away the elements that make these processes very democratic. So if I were to try to think about one AI use in deliberation that would be misguided, I would think of the following process. If we were to use demographic data from, let's say, census information, and we try to prompt AI personas, so you have the different personas based on just different characteristics that you identify in a group, and then you make these personas talk to one another and they deliberate, and then you take the outcome of this deliberation as an AI deliberative processes. I think we could all agree that this would be quite a misguided use of AI, and I think maybe for at least two reasons. One is that it might reduce the task of deliberation to decoding preferences, and the idea that you can just purely identify a preference based on just this prompted persona, which I think we could agree would be problematic. The other aspect would be that this would be assuming that there is a latent kind of collective will from a group that ought to be just discovered and can be fully discovered through automating processes that would not work well. And to anchor really, I think this idea of two of the things I'm worried about thinking about the AI integration in deliberative processes are one, the gradual disempowerment of the users, the fact that decisions can become more data-driven and less participatory, so the individual lose their sense of agency over the political outcomes. The second aspect would be post-rationalized legitimacy, the idea that if we claim that a process is democratic and at larger scale, the fact that we can just give legitimacy to this process perhaps for the wrong reasons, and we can legitimize outcomes in a way that's very, I fear, misguided. So with that in mind, the dimension that I found super interesting, and I found all the 5 dimensions super interesting, but I think this misguided example of how AI could be wrongly used in deliberation, in a sense, scales up, out, across, and deep in some ways, so it could be used to scale in these different ways. The piece I feel it's not scaling in is the scale in the 5th dimension. And so I'm really interested in thinking more about how we can enhance the deliberative experience with this kind of AI processes. And specifically, when I think about the scaling in dimension, I think I break it down in 3 pieces. The first one, and I'll come back in more details about it, is how we can scale this reflective moment. The second is how we can scale the making of the social fabric. The fact that this, maybe this, I can describe it as the slow and difficult work of processing the disagreement and building legitimacy. And there is an anecdote that I love that I learned about from Claudia in the French Citizen Assembly about the end of life. I found this beautiful moment that to me really embodies what it is to the making of the social fabric, of a participant saying that she had personal beliefs against the end of life. And she remained against this at the personal level, but through this process, she felt heard and understood why it could matter for other people, and ended up voting in favor of the end of life proposal, while being herself still not agreeing with this statement. Which I really think of this making of the social fabric and creating connections beyond disagreements. The third aspect would be collective sense making, the fact that we're trying to map out perspectives. And one piece I also found interesting that is mentioned in the paper is how AI could be used to represent unmentioned perspectives. The fact that you might not have all the perspectives mentioned at the table, and you could use AI to kind of fill these kind of gaps. But I'd like to dwell on a little bit on these reflective moments specifically. And I think of this reflective moment as it's maybe the internal or private moment where the individuals reconsider their own views in light of that of others, learn about new facts, and might do this before the deliberating process. So this almost conditioning before you enter a deliberative moment, thinking, how do I now pause and think back about my perspectives in the context of that of others? And I've been, so, strictly speaking, this might not count as deliberation per your framework, Claudia and Sammy, because it might be something that can be done asynchronously. But I'm wondering what you think about thinking of this as a precondition of the deliberative moments. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about tools that can present the individuals with verbatim statements from others they are about to meet, or tools where users can, or individuals can, prompt asks for fact, reflections, or counterpoints or clarification. So I think this is one of the aspects that I'm quite interested in this AI for this kind of moments. I feel it's part of scaling in. Maybe we can call it scaling within, and I'm calling it scaling within because it's a piece from Goodin, who has a paper called Deliberation Within, which is precisely this reflective moment of someone taking a time and asking questions. Just as a wrapping thoughts, I want to kind of zoom out and think through the fact that there is this idea of intersection of technology and democracy is quite old. I think we can at least trace it back to polls that became systematized by Dr. Gallup around the first half of the 21st century. And the different interactions we've seen from a poll that is eliciting constrained opinions on constrained options evolved into something like Polis or Remesh, which introduced this idea of aggregating open-ended statements, which I think I found is a very nice, step towards gathering something that looks more like human thought. And some of the more recent work that you mentioned in the paper, like the Habermas machine or the generative social choice approaches, are ways to use LLM precisely for their capacity to handle open-ended thoughts, to create this argumentative coherent summaries. In the Habermas machine case, this is done in a way that you can then send back the summary for the humans to critique. In the generative social choice, it's trying to precisely, I think, aim at this point of collective sense making and representing perspectives that might not have been in the poll. And I think there is a rich history that we are definitely building off. To conclude, one question and one quote. The question is, I'd love to hear your thoughts about specifically thinking about these reflective moments, and what do you think about using artificial intelligence to almost precondition the deliberation, and how you think this can scaffold the later steps. And the quote is one I really like from Dostoevsky, which was written in 1864, but I find very topical for this question about the intersection of democracy and technology in the present times. So I'm reading it. And indeed, well, if one day they really find the formula for all our wanting and caprices, that is, what they depend on by precisely what law they occur, precisely how they spread, what they strive for, in such and such case, and so on and so forth. So again, if one day they really find the formula for all our wanting, a real mathematical formula, that is, then perhaps man will immediately stop wanting. For who wants to want, according to a little table? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That quote is beautiful and quite relevant. And you've added a sixth dimension here of scaling within. So thank you for that. I realize we're just about at the hour here, and so I want to start integrating some of the questions and comments from the chat. So thank you so much to everyone. Just to read one comment first, and I think Manon, you were already preempting this question about going a bit deeper into what scaling in means. Philip had a comment here saying, I believe one of the most important aspects of deliberative democracy is that it makes people to discover each other's perspectives, and for that to happen, there needs to be disagreements and friction. If we make AI a go-to tool in deliberations, I'm concerned that deliberating participants will use it to resolve any tense situations instead of actually deliberating with one another. And so I'm curious if Claudia and Sammy and our discussants as well can speak to maybe this balance between using AI as a democratic shortcut, perhaps, that tries to make the process very smooth, very efficient, versus a tool that can kind of tease out these points of friction, and to allow for deeper understanding. Can we go maybe one layer deeper into those elements?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and kick off on that, and then happy for Sammy and others to come in. And also really huge thanks to Oliver, Kyle, and Manon for your deep reflections. Appreciate you taking the time, and I've noted down so many things. And oh my God, I've just like emerged from noting down while you're speaking to see the chat and the Q&A. And I think this points to like the trouble with doing stuff virtually in these spaces where I haven't read any of that yet, but I'll read it after. So I'm going to concentrate on what's been said in the conversation so far, though I promise I'll read the other stuff later. But I mean I love that the word friction has come up, because I think intentionally designing for friction, maybe this is a missing thing in the paper actually, that we did not use that word somehow. To me feels really important, and is really within the, I would say, the spirit and the ethos of how we were thinking about this and approaching it. I think if people have read, or when you read the paper, you'll probably pick up on the fact that we're not trying to make claims or suggesting that like there's a benefit to just efficiency or wanting to also speed up or eliminate some of the friction. Actually, we're really focusing on and again, I think that's why that aspect of scaling in has come up quite a lot actually in some of the conversations we've had it as well, about, you know, there's a need to be very intentional with how we're designing with AI into the processes that we're doing, because I think part of the risk, and I think part of some of them skepticisms and concerns that Sammy and I have written about or alluded to a little bit when it comes to some of the approaches that are being used to try and scale out with an emphasis on headcount versus some of the other dimensions, kind of alludes to some of the things that are being done that might be going in that direction as well. Whereas there's a benefit to designing things that are slow, designing things that give people the time and space to getting to a certain point. You know, it makes me think of a conversation that we just had with some of my team who was in the Gambia last week, and they were working on designing an assembly that's going to take place later this year, and talking through part of a process of how they're going to do the sortition there and so on. But the starting point was really like taking a step back and letting people locally and within that context think through, okay, we have a general principle of sortition, how might we apply it here? And actually, the endpoint was very similar to what is just like a very typical standard way we might do things. But I think the whole process of having a 2-hour conversation that was led by people who will be doing the process itself, getting to a point of coming to a conclusion that they found consensus on, rather than us as organizers saying, okay, this is how we do it. You know, we could have saved 2 hours, but actually the whole point of having a process where you go through the like process of thinking things through, hearing one another, debating different options, and arriving at a conclusion you agree to, has in itself a benefit. And I think we need to kind of always keep that in mind when we're thinking through like when or how might we use technology, and how can we be really thoughtful and therefore intentional about where we'll use it, and where, even if it might be possible, we'll choose not to do it as well. So I'll leave it there. I want to come back on some of the questions also, like from Oliver and Manon and Kyle, but those were just some of like the top reflections from that first question with friction that was prompted.
Yeah, I could also say a few things on this. I agree with everything Claudia said there. I think something that's important to note is that you can use these tools in different ways throughout the process, and it's actually about the sequencing of it I think is important. So if we're just like at the service level, using it straight away to try to identify consensus. And I think that is definitely problematic and moving away from these important frictions. We can also think about using it, earlier stages to help like disaggregate disagreements, and then building up over time, maybe thinking about towards the end of the process, if there are real sticking points, how might it be able to, um, overcome some of those tensions. I might take the liberty to respond to a few of the comments that have come up. So Oliver asked a great question around whether our approach kind of gives up on the idea of building deliberative democracy at scale. And I think this is a great question. It's super interesting. And I think what I would say is that I don't think it does. I think what we would suggest is that deliberative democracy at scale requires quality, small scale forms, and it requires these to be connected in meaningful ways to other sites and other processes. And ultimately, I think there's something that AI enables or could potentially enable is a diversification of our repertoire of deliberative processes. And if that entails mass deliberation, then I think that's great. If it entails supporting small scale forms, that's also great. And these different types of processes can serve different goals within the overall democratic system. So I also loved Oliver's points about civic infrastructure building, political economy, so important. I'll mention something about Kyle's remark. I wanted to pick up on this. So Kyle mentioned about this kind of judo move dimension. I enjoyed there was your choice of martial arts been evolving as well since our last talk. But so the idea here is, and I've heard this come up a lot, that's why I wanted to mention it, is that the paper in a way kind of expands the concept of scale into many different domains. And I think there's three reasons why this is quite important. The first is that actually across various disciplines and even within deliberative democracy literature itself, it's actually quite normal to talk about scale as multidimensional. And the second thing is that this holisticness, I think, is really important because we can obviously think about each of these dimensions in isolation, but in having them under one banner, we can think about this in a more holistic way. And I think that's important. And lastly, the concept of scale is obviously being spoken about anyway, especially within the technology sector, but across society more broadly. And so I think what we try to do is like almost like rehabilitate the word, make it a more mature word that's fit for purpose in our specific democratic context. And the last thing, I really love Manon's points about scaling in. I think this has definitely just got like a whole new paper or multiple papers to like dive into. So I'll stop there.
Thanks to both of you. Maybe a question to Oliver. So one one issue that maybe hasn't been named explicitly, but has been signaled to with discussion of autocracy and risk of maybe going into a world of passivity or something like that is the question of capture, and how any democratic process can be susceptible to capture from tech companies or governments or other actors. But there's a question about the role of how scale and scaling these processes might interplay with questions of capture and democracy washing or something like that. And one question that's related to this came from Shu Lin, who asked, in scaling up, could you or anyone make examples of experiments, tools, approaches out there scaling up through embedding reasonings in deliberative outputs, i.e. reports, so the reports become a way to hold implementation accountable and in a way make the process more legitimate? So this is a question of what are the ways that we can integrate AI to ensure that these processes have actionable outcomes and are less susceptible to capture, maybe.
Yeah, these are very, very easy questions, Andrew. Thank you for those. Okay, I'll say a couple of things, but I'm sure others will have ideas on this. You know, in terms of capture, the one thing we know is that we need to be very careful not to build these systems in a way that are so centralized that all you need to do in order to capture them is to take the center. So unless these things are built as systems of distributed, networked intelligence and civic infrastructure, they are going to remain vulnerable. That applies to other civic infrastructure. It will apply to this as well. That's what I would say on that. But then as I was listening to Manon and Kyle and others and trying to keep up with the chat, I was also thinking, I think it's going to become quite clear that there are a number of uses of AI that we don't want in citizens' assemblies, right? For example, you don't want the 100 or 200 members of the assembly, each of them to turn up with their AI pet to help them do the thinking, right? You don't want to delegate their civic duty. This will be the AI equivalent of clicktivism, another great undermining dynamic of digital participation. So we are going to have to think very carefully. AI is going to have to come with an AI minder, a team of translators and critical friends who are there to say, well, we are going to use it in this way, in that way. The group can, use it to help with a counter argument, help to elicit friction when there is apparent consensus emerging, help to test arguments. I think there is going to be a great deal of how to partner, how to get the human in the loop to maximize the deliberative potential. I certainly wouldn't see AI as a kind of a tool that is just let into these spaces without clear governance and control and so on. And also, I mean, Manon, you were talking about large language models. That's where we are, but things are moving fast. We are going to see quite remarkable things over the next 10, 20 years. And I think, we should aspire for AI tools to be more deliberative themselves. If we build in deliberative principles within these systems, that has a lot of potential, right? And if AI is not seeing, the metaphors are really going to matter. At the moment, a lot of people think about AI because of the particular user interfaces that are emerging. We see AI as an oracle. We go there to ask questions and get the right answers. If we saw AI more as a facilitator of deliberation, as asking as many questions as trying to answer them, as helping to make as many connections as it tries to do other things, then I think things could change. So this is not just about how we use AI as it exists at the moment, but it's about saying, what would deliberative AI look like? How could it be built in a way that is genuinely useful, doesn't take over, and doesn't make citizens misunderstand that this is going to discharge their civic duty and their thinking for them. If it's going to do that, we are in trouble. So we need to think very carefully. I'll stop there, but yeah, that's what's coming to mind at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite insightful. Maybe a question for Kyle now. You spoke already about trade-offs. And trade-offs of using AI for scale. I think one of the things we might want to consider, and this was raised by Hector in the chat, is how scaling processes with AI might make them more susceptible to bias or may implicate the inclusion or exclusion of certain voices, right? Like one of the beauties of small scale deliberation is that you can ensure that the conversation to an extent surfaces different viewpoints and that people, even from a minority perspective, have the ability to voice their concerns with the way that the discussion is going. And so what Hector wrote was, I wonder if favoring AI without safeguards will multiply existing disparities and shortcomings that some democratic environments have, like minority rule or elite dominance, and also deal with multiculturalism and the right to self-determination that communities may or may not have. Could a world with AI agents designed to represent communities offer ways to experiment, inform, and improve processes for better connections?
Yeah, wow.
A hard one.
I have a lot of thoughts. I think so. Deliberative processes, what makes them really awesome is that we are thinking through all these problems already in terms of our existing institutions. And so things like the question before on accountability, it's like we are already thinking through how these processes are not captured in some way by the people who are organizing them. And while the introduction of this technology will make things maybe more challenging across some dimensions, I think it does enable a whole bunch of different things. I think the use of the word safeguard in that question was probably doing a lot of lifting there, because without them, I think, of course, things are probably going to go poorly. So we will need to be quite intentional and measured in the way in which we introduce this technology. I think now is a really good time to be starting to get familiar with what different opportunities there are so that we can get used to it while it's maybe in its infancy and not already taking over and eating up a bunch of the other roles that are performed in these processes. I think the other thing that I heard mentioned in there, and I think was mentioned elsewhere, was just around this like disempowerment type stuff and the way in which technology can enable participants to play a back seat or almost coddle them through the delivery of a deliberation. And I think that already happens in some processes now where people view the facilitation role as to almost take a lot of the responsibility away from the participants, and they're just there to give their opinions and then like pop in and out. And I see this happening sometimes with online deliberation stuff where it's difficult to build connection between people, and it feels almost like taking your turn at the lectern. And I think lots of people in the space already see that as problematic. And we do a lot of work in the early phases of a deliberation to upskill participants with critical thinking, with understanding how they think about different issues themselves, but also how interacting with one another. And I think Manon made a really excellent point around building that sort of social fabric. I think that happens both just interacting with people that are in your community that you probably never would have normally met is a really beautiful moment that happens in deliberations. But then there is also that moment of interacting with people who you build connections with because of their similarities based on maybe where they live or how old they are. But then you realize maybe they have slightly different views to you, and you have to realize that someone who has a different view is not an alien. And people kind of have this like delivery processes are beautiful at doing that type of stuff. And I think we can use this technology to help do the upskilling rather than having them de-skill people throughout the process. I think that's really important. I think there was another piece in there around other sort of how we can, Oliver mentioned the enabling more deliberative AI. I think there's a lot of tricky technical stuff around the alignment stuff, but I think there are really cool opportunities to use deliberative processes to inform the way in which these tools are either built, but also the rules with which they hopefully obey. And the Democracy Foundation's been doing some work with UK ARIA on safeguarded AI, and I think that's just one of many different ways in which we can think about democratizing the rule set or the development of this technology as well as using it in those processes. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think you touched very specifically on a comment that was made by Philip in the chat as well, which is that it's important to consider the effect that AI has on deliberative skill, right? And on the way that these technologies are prime us to relate to our communities and other people more broadly in our neighborhoods and societies. There's a question from Ben Redhead that is a bit more specific that I would love to get Claudia and Sammy's take on, and it's a bit difficult to answer, I think. But it implicates the question of legitimacy and its relationship to scale. So Ben wrote, when we talk about scaling out, is there a number we should be aiming for to claim legitimacy? For example, a percentage of the public we want to be involved, or is it just as much as possible?
Yeah, happy to jump in on this. I think this in a way also interacts a bit with like one of the questions that Oliver posed to us related to scaling out as well. And I think also alludes to something, actually, I don't remember who said it. Maybe you said it, Andrew. Also, Andrew and I have been doing a bit of work and thinking around trying to reframe the notion of legitimacy through the lens of deliberative democracy, which extends here because I think that actually, Kyle said this at one point, where there's been a notion that legitimacy has been equated to how many numbers and how many people are participating based on the lens through which we tend to view it through our existing electoral and representative institutions of what we think about as democracy today. But there's no reason to think that the only thing from which legitimacy stems from is numbers. So I'm now repeating Kyle, who also mentioned other factors to do with fairness and transparency and other kind of aspects of this. And I think actually this has been one of the main arguments of people who are pushing forth ideas of sortition being a legitimate selection mechanism for representatives of a wider group of people as well. I think a lot of the pushback has come from reasons to do with lack of familiarity rather than like deep philosophical convincing arguments about why that's not a legitimate way for a group of people to represent others. So this is like a roundabout way of me going around the question of, I personally am not very convinced by like more people equals more legitimacy as a very compelling argument. I think that it's also, in some ways, maybe this is a bit controversial. I'm not sure necessarily everyone here agrees with me, but I think it's been partly detrimental to some of the way and energy in which like energy has gone into the kinds of tech, the kinds of processes that we're designing, which many of which I think in what I would consider maybe an early phase of participatory democracy 1.0 really emphasized, let's try to get as many people as possible involved to comment or to give their opinion or to share a view on something. But I think that this, first of all, to me, it's not really a desirable goal in the sense of like, we can't all be involved in everything all the time. So there's a beauty in sortition of that rotation of power and privilege of responsibility of being involved. But there's also the fact that we also want to value the depth and the more informed sense of like what people are coming with. So the emphasis on numbers has often, when we're talking about the trade-offs where people have been designing things that scale out, I guess on that kind of, Kyle, you were also referring to this when it comes to like the question around metrics and time. How much time do we need at a minimum to come to what can be an informed decision? Like one of the things that, again, we need better metrics to be have like precise data about this. But one of the things I've noticed about many of the scaled out approaches is they're also a lot less time intensive than the in-person kind of deliberative mini publics that we're talking about. So again, there's like, we're never just talking about one dimension when we're trying to answer this question of legitimacy, I think is what I'm trying to get to. And I think that's also partly why we've been trying to emphasize the need to think about these 5 dimensions holistically and to understand that anytime we put more emphasis on one, there's ultimately always going to be a trade-off with another. And I think the other trade-off that comes with them scaling out dimension is, I think there's two, like one claim that gets made quite often that these are also going to be like much cheaper processes because we can have AI facilitators instead of human facilitators that are expensive and so on. But I think one of the unsaid aspects of that claim is also like, it's only cheaper if we're not paying people for their time and if we're getting people to deliberate for a lot less time. So those are also other trade-offs that need to be considered in all of the questions. And so is a process that has 10,000 people that have been unpaid for their limited amount of time deliberating on a process more legitimate than a smaller scale process with less people, but people who have spent maybe 6 months and have all been paid and are more representative, more legitimate? I think that's the kind of like dilemmas that we're all facing in terms of what we're thinking about here.
I realize we have only 10 minutes left here. I want to make sure we kind of broaden the scope of the conversation maybe and bring in other elements that have been raised in the chat. There have been a number of folks that have asked more strategic questions about implementation and uptake of deliberative processes. So, for instance, we have one comment from Ilsa Byrne-Murdoch, who wrote, "Fascinated to understand how we can use AI to game web and social media algorithms to help with the storytelling aspect of using deliberation. One of our biggest challenges is not running the processes themselves. It's raising knowledge that it's happening." And there's a number of other comments about the relationship between deliberative democracy and political economy, how we align incentives such that these things pop up in more places, right? I think there's often an assumption that, as Claudia, you just said, if you lower the cost of these things, suddenly they'll happen everywhere. But that's a huge assumption to make, and not actually what we're finding. And so I'm curious if anyone has thoughts. This can be open to the whole group, on the strategic element of this, what it will require of political organizers and storytellers and everyone else.
I'm happy to go quickly and then hand it over. I think, Andrew, there's some interesting stuff in here around there are so many different theories of change. And I think one of the ones that I interact with often is that you need to convince people that currently wield power that they are going to hand off to a different process that may involve some sharing of risk, but that the capabilities of that process are going to match the capabilities or roughly close to it of what their existing systems are. And at the moment, a lot of decision makers don't see the kind of evidence that's convincing them, and then they might use something like cost or lack of feasibility as an excuse to not do a process. And I think improving our capabilities, as I kind of mentioned, will let us then demonstrate that these things are suitable replacements for or like complementary mechanisms that can go with existing systems.
Would it be rude, Manon, to put you on the spot here, just because I haven't directed a question to you, just for your insights on the political uptake question as well?
No, not really at all. So I come from the technology side of things, and so I think thought quite a bit about the design. Something I became super increasingly aware of is that it's really important to have a theory of change coming with that design, and it's something that DemocracyNext and Claudia very specifically have opened my eyes over the years about the that aspect, which is something I think I'm still learning about. So I don't feel I have an insight that I would feel confident in sharing, besides saying that it's something, perhaps coming from the just the technology side, it's something I can't, I think agree more with the authors, is that there is a tendency to code our way out of things, and the idea that we can do great things with new tools, and hence we ought, but that's of course not really true. And if anything, I think having more forums for these groups to really engage, maybe that would be my insight, is trying to have more events like this one for technologists to be exposed to that political reality and the path for changes that have, as Claudia and Sammy say, nothing to do with technology, but all to do with the political landscape and the social dynamics, is something that I think would be just very impactful from my perspective.
Yeah, Andre, if I may comment on political uptake, I'll just share just a couple of quick thoughts. Yeah, I was gonna say I'm fortunate, but I don't know if I'm fortunate. I've been lucky to be in spaces where I get to hear the reasoning that politicians bring to the table when you present them with this kind of proposition. And the best I can use a metaphor to compare the current generation of political leaders is the crew of the Titanic. Most of them see the iceberg of autocratic regimes coming, of democratic backsliding, but they're not prepared to change the course of the Titanic. Yet there are a few exceptions, and as there was in the Titanic, some people wanted to change direction and were pressing the leadership. They didn't obviously accomplish what they were trying to do, and that's in terms of theory of change, is how do you go from this critical mass where you have some democratic innovators spread across different institutions to a critical mass where you begin to craft alliances amongst those who see that unless you redevelop our democracy, deepen our democracy, we're going to be in deep trouble, and we're not going to cope with the challenges that are coming our way. So it's it's going to be a slow process, but part of it is about engaging with good old fashioned challenges of political work. We still need to reform our traditional institutions. We still need to get back into thinking carefully about bureaucracies and state power, all these less kind of appealing elements. We tend to focus on the really exciting innovations, but a lot of the older stuff requires attention because it needs to be changed if this stuff is to have a real chance.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you and to everyone in the chat for what a wonderful event and all of your participation. I want to ask just one more question before we close. And this can be to all five of you as well, although I certainly want to hear from Claudia and Sammy. Kyle mentioned during his remarks the importance of metrics and ways to measure success as we integrate new technology into democratic deliberation. Let's say we zoom out 20 years from now, hopefully sooner than that, and we have scaled up AI-enabled democratic deliberation. What is the single metric or a combination of metrics that we should be looking for to be able to say that was a success? And realize that is awfully reductive and impossible to do. But I'll pass it back to Claudia and Sammy maybe for final reflections on that.
Yeah, yeah, happy to jump in on that. I think in about maybe like the 30 seconds I have, I think I would say that something that I would love to see within in 20 years' time is that, you know, almost everyone, or at least everyone knows people who have participated in these kinds of processes. Like that's the kind of scale that we're going to. I think it's still quite rare to bump into people who have participated in these processes, who have been invited to participate. And something that would be really important for me, from my perspective, is that it just becomes normalized. Everyone's aware of it, and it's a part of day-to-day political and civic life.
I'm going to take the easy route and say I agree with Sammy on that. But also, I mean, one of the things that I had wanted to come back on is that I also am totally in agreement and excited by Kyle's point about metrics and wanting and needing better empirical evidence, but and also excited by how technology, not necessarily just AI, but actually even simple things like the fact that, you know, we're starting to record the entirety of deliberations that are taking place, which of course come with their own cautions, considerations, other things, etc. So caveats there, but still having full transcripts of all of the small groups and large groups and the dynamics and so on, in itself, that opens up totally new research avenues, new ways of being able to measure, understand, and evaluate assemblies too. So I'm also very excited by that dimension. But I'm aware that we're kind of at the 1 minute moment of time. So I just really also wanted to say a big thank you to all of the panelists from my side and all of the amazing and rich comments and questions that I'm going to spend some time reading after this. This has been a very, very, very rich discussion and a lot of different questions to think about. And I'm, you know, maybe in some of my earlier responses, I also reflected some of the like maybe cautious parts of also how I'm thinking about this. But I think I also want to emphasize a lot of excitement. And, you know, the short answer to Manon's question to us is like, yes, I think we should be exploring that. And it's also why, you know, we mentioned with Sammy, we're quite excited by things like the Habermas machine and generative social choice. And even if in itself, that to me feels like a stretch of that being really deliberative, but how can it connect with deliberative processes and be supportive of, and what's the relationship? Like there's such a richness of things. And I actually think it's just quite hard to imagine what in 20 years time, all of the possibilities on that more technical front will be. So I think keeping that open-mindedness while exploring with a critically informed view of things is what we need, and excited to be doing that collectively with everyone.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the profoundly exciting potential of these technologies and the importance of forums like this one to go about it. And I just want to thank everyone again for your time, to our panelists, to Claudia and Sammy, for giving us the fodder for such a wonderful conversation, and looking forward to doing this again, hopefully soon.